Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Gresham College for our contribution to the Year of the Sea. I'm very pleased today to have Tim Severin with us, and you'll see from the programme that he's going to be talking about the Brendan Voyage. In fact, we had to hesitate as to ask which of his many voyages he could actually come and talk to us about, because he really does seem to have been around most of the oceans of the world in as many fragile craft as anyone could imagine. As far as I know, I don't think he's been across the Atlantic in a coracle, but that's probably coming up. And what I like, I think, is this combination of the idea of picking up on a legend to see whether it could be true, looking at the materials which were available to the people at the time and seeing whether there was enough truth in the materials to see if the story was possible, and then, of course, picking up on the wonderful sense of adventure, which must be fairly hazardous even in this day of satellite navigation, let alone in the days when people did set out into the broad unknown. And I think that also gives us quite an interesting insight into the personal courage of Sinbad the Sailor and Brendan and Jason and the Argonauts and the rest. But I think it also suggests to us that adventure isn't entirely dead today either. So I look forward very much to hearing about St. Brendan. Tim.
Thank you for coming along to listen to me today. What I'm going to talk to you about is a voyage that I made in 1976, 1977, and it took 2 sailing seasons. It wasn't intended that way. The idea was actually to do it in a single season. And it was the first of my major projects. And it was to replicate, to test whether the story of St. Brendan, which was hugely well known during the later Middle Ages, the story, the Navigatio, the Voyage of St. Brendan, who sets out with a party of monks in a boat made of leather and has various adventures on the way, stops at various islands, and reaches a great land far in the west. Some people, of course, have said that he reached North America. Well, I made the voyage really to test whether that was physically possible. When I say that it was very well known, it was well known to the extent that Columbus, when he was halfway across, actually stopped his little flotilla of 3 vessels and said, "This is about the area where we should find the islands which St. Brendan visited." And Columbus believed in that, and the islands were marked on the map. So I made the Brendan voyage really to see if this could have been possible, and researched the sort of vessel that might have been made. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the documentary film of that voyage, and during this I'm going to stop it and comment and so forth on how it's going.
100 miles out in the North Atlantic, a small open boat runs for her life before a force 9 gale. A boat from another century, a boat made of leather. On board, 5 men risk cold, discomfort, and their lives. Their purpose? To pursue a legend.
Now, this is the route that fits the Brendan story, and I wanted to follow from Ireland, round the Hebrides, to Faroes, to Iceland, to North America. The reason for that was that Brendan does have all these adventures on the way. He stops at different islands, they land on the back of a whale, they do all these sort of episodes which seem to be utterly fantastic. There had been previous attempts to, if you like, replicate a Brendan voyage, but by going southward, which is the downhill, easy route, from the west of Ireland essentially down to the West Indies, which is, you know, the route that small boats can make with the greatest of ease. I wanted to go the difficult way. And the first thing to do, obviously, was to try and make as accurate...
Past many other islands, to a vast land far across the sea. Could he have reached America 900 years before Columbus? To test this theory in a replica of his boat was the object of the Brendan voyage. The early Christian Irish were famous as...
Now, I live in County Cork in southwest Ireland, and it's very unusual to have pictures of early boats. And here is one. It's called the Bantry Stone. This was carved, we think, about 700 or 800 AD, and it shows there 4 men rowing in a sort of a funny banana-shaped thing with the 5th man sits in the stern with a steering paddle, and then over the top of the steering paddle is a cross, and we think that might have symbolized the hand of God guides the navigators. This would have been carved almost certainly by Irish monks, and it is, as I said, really unusual to have pictures of early boats, and that would have been one of the guidelines I used. Another guideline would be the type of boat which is a descendant boat. So there's the ethnography and also the historical evidence. Now, the ethnography is really this. It's the descendant boat, which is the curragh. This is a dingle curragh, and it's rowed, again, in this case, by 4 men. There's no
Both
steersman.
curragh and carving point to the shape of St. Brendan's boat, but the legend said it was skinned with hide, weak stuff to face an ocean. Yet testing did...
Now, this was a very important part. The whole idea was to get the materials testing done properly. I had an enormous amount of help from the British leather industry. They had a research organization, and they tested the different types of leather. It was quite easy for me to know what sort of leather would have skinned St. Brendan's boat. And the story of St. Brendan says he skins the boat with hides tanned in oak bark. Interestingly, the early scholars never cottoned on to what never translated the Latin correctly. They thought that the word oak came in. They thought it was something to do with oak being used for the structure of the boat. But it's actually what the Latin text says is that this is oak bark tanned leather. Oak bark tanning was the type of tannage that was used at the time. We knew that because in the museums of Ireland you find Bible satchels contemporary with St. Brendan. Leather satchels, a bit like briefcases, made by the monks to carry their most precious belongings, the holy texts. That told us the type of leather, the thickness of the leather. It also told us what they used for stitching. They used flax. That even told us the type of stitching. It was amazing, actually, to have physical evidence of really what their technology was like. So, with the tests, actually showed that the leather made in St. Brendan's day was, provided it was soaked in grease, was going to stand up to the ocean better than many modern tannages. There was one place that still made oak bark leather. Actually, there were 2, but this was the key one. It was down a firm called Josiah Croghan in Cornwall, and they still made leather with oak bark tannage, And that...
For their boats, the Irish wrote how they then dressed their leather with grease. But they did omit one detail. Greased ox hides stink.
That leather tannage, I mean, the Croghan family were absolutely extraordinary. I asked them to obtain hides from small cattle, because cattle were obviously smaller in the early Middle Ages. And it took months and months to tan the leather in the correct way. And throughout the process, we tried to be as exact with the technology. And the curious thing was that as the voyage unfolded, it turned out that what we were depending upon was the accuracy of our materials, and that the earlier materials were exactly what we needed for the project. So we had the ox hides. We tested the boat out in it was all very rushed, although it had taken about 4 years to prepare all this. As usual, everything was a bit of a rush. This is on the Shannon, where we've got the hull of the boat. Now, even the timber had to be right. We knew that there was oak growing in Ireland at the time, but the most suitable timber for the curved ribs of the boat was ash. It is the flexible timber, and again, I went to the experts, and his Irish accent is a little bit difficult to comprehend, but this is another of the skilled people without whom this would not have been possible. It's a man called Paddy Glennon in County Longford, timber trading family, and I went out with him to cut down the ash trees. And this, I mean, he's just marvellous. He tells me what part of the ash tree I should use.
To build his replica of St. Brendan's boat for the modern voyage, historian and explorer Tim Severin had devoted several years to a close study of the early Irish, their voyages, boats and building materials.
What you want, especially for masts, you want something that'll be very subtle.
Yeah,
quickly.
Yeah, would do well.
You know, very. This is what you want. The north side of it,
yes.
The rings are a little bit narrower, closer together here than they are on the south side, the sunny side. So for any of the better quality pieces, yes, we will try and take the boat of the north side.
It was, I mean, literally that man, and he said, this is where we would, it's the north side of the ash tree that we cut the hurley sticks. He said, this, if you want really good hurley sticks for playing hurley, they must be carved from the north-facing timber of an ash tree. I mean, it's the sort of information which made this whole project, as it turned out to be, the success that it was. So timber, flax, which came from the linen people up in the north of Ireland, we assembled them all down near where I live in County Cork, and we made out the shape of the boat. The naval architect involved was a man called Colin Moody, who is the real guru of replica vessels today. You'll be familiar with other of his vessels, like the vessel that went to Canada. He does a lot of sail training ships, and Colin did the designs, and he has this wonderful phrase. He said he can do all the sort of the technical aspects, but what is important is, he said, is listen to the craftsman. And in County Cork, we began to assemble, if you like, or make our vessel.
Oak gunnels like the rib cage of a stranded whale. The loose frame would be lashed together with leather thongs. Here, George Maloney joined the project, Tim's first choice for crew as sailing master.
Are you running out of those thicker ones, George? Yeah. Thicker ones, man.
Do you find that they're stretching enough when you do that? When you're pulling on them?
The job was backbreaking. Day after day, they crouched inside the wooden skeleton, poking and groping for slippery strips of leather. then heaving the knots tight until their muscles ached. 2 miles of leather secured the frame with 1,600 knots.
Slides up.
The ultimate key person in the construction of this vessel was this man, John O'Connell, harness maker. Now, as I said, we had Bible satchels. We saw how the monks used to stitch leather. They were highly skilled. I needed to find somebody who knew how to work leather, very thick leather. Now, I went round saddlers and so forth, and they said, it's not a saddler's job, it's a harness maker's job. And harness makers are very few and far between. Yesterday evening, I was watching television, this morning, and Roy Strong was talking about coronations and so forth. He's got a book on that. And they showed the coronation coach. The man who refurbished the straps and the leather harness for the coronation coach was this man, John O'Connell. And as I went round trying to find a harness maker, and I went to the Royal Saddlers here, and I went to Saddlers in Ireland, they said, no, you must find a harness maker. And people referred to this guy, John O'Connell. They said, he comes from Ireland, but he's left the trade, we don't know where to find him. And I hunted around, and I couldn't find anybody, and I actually had started the construction of the boat in Crosshaven in County Cork. And I still didn't have somebody to show us how to sew the leather. And I heard of a saddler, retired saddler. I went in Cork City, I went to his place, tracked him down, and he came to the door. He was obviously well past doing any sort of work of that type. And I said, just at the end, I said, do you know where ever heard of John O'Connell? He said, yeah, he's living up on the housing estate over in Bishopstown. So I went up to Bishopstown, and there was a modern housing estate, and I stopped somebody there, and I said, do you know John O'Connell? And they said, we got several O'Connells here. And I said, well, this will be a fellow with huge arms. That'll be John at number 8. And I went there, and John came down. You can just, as he's doing this, just look at the strength. This is a man, now deceased, whose knowledge of leatherworking was absolutely unsurpassed.
Age of all. The outer skin of hide. To stitch it, they used threads of hand-rolled flax, another raw material from St. Brendan's day. To show them how came John O'Connell, harness maker. O'Connell also oversaw the cutting of the 49 ox hides needed, fitting them neatly around the contours of the wooden frame.
The next one out, we're going to straighten that right up to nothing there. The next hide will come over in line with this. One stitching here, two more here.
And that
double
gives,
stitching.
that gives the double thickness of leather.
Double thickness of leather
on the
bottom.
He was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, John oversaw what we were doing. He showed us how to do it. The difficult bits he would do himself. And if anything was wrong, he would say, rip it. We could work for a whole day, and he'd come with that little half-moon knife, and he would just slash all the stitches, said, not good enough. You're going to depend upon it. He was quite extraordinary. And we worked throughout the winter. The last thing we did was we spread wool grease on the hull. The leather itself had been soaked, had been impregnated with wool grease, and we had the boat ready. It took us about 4 to 5 months to actually build her, and in a bitterly cold January day, she was ready to be launched at Crosshaven, and there she is. She's all ready. And that was the day, of course, we came down and to launch such a vessel. We had the Bishop of Kerry. We launched her and took her then. She'd never been out to sea before. We took her up to the place where traditionally St. Brendan started from, on the coast of Kerry. There's my daughter at that stage. She's now considerably older than that. And this is the creek from which Brendan is alleged to have set out with his party of monks. And I had a crew for this very typical West Cork people, West Kerry people. The sail mark, the Irish cross, yellow canvas oilskin, so that if people were looking for us from the air, we would be visible. I want you just to have a look. This is the first day out to sea. We had no escort vessel. This is filmed from a fishing boat nearby. And just see how this vessel, which is 36 feet long and has just got 18 inches in the water, see how easily she rolls on top of the waves. Very sort of, I have to say, we were pretty scared starting out. Look at that. She absolutely no keel underneath her, sort of like a leather banana. And we ran immediately into this heavy weather.
Brendan was put to the test. Hit by gales. Now 5 men's lives depended on her sound construction and their own endurance.
At the time, this seemed to be very poor luck for us. But as it turned out, it was the right thing to have happened, because we ran into a gale on the first night, which blew us way out to sea. And it scared us, but it showed that the boat could survive a gale. And we were blown back to the land, and we had learned our lessons. This is very politically incorrect. In those days, if you had stuff which was rubbish, you tended to throw it overboard. I had made a mistake. I had thought that what the food we should take would be the sort of food that mountaineers would use. Our plastic bags split, the seawater came in, all that lovely dehydrated food rehydrated and was completely useless. Our leather boat, the medieval boat, had held up, but our modern food had not. And we had learned a few lessons about sailing on a medieval boat. Out of sight of land until then, and the first time she really went out of sight of land was as the victim of a quite strong gale. I made certain mental notes. One of the most important was never to boat without the stores and particularly the water to face at least 2 weeks, because one could be driven offshore 2 weeks away from gaining land and fresh water again. And in a medieval boat, you have to have that leeway of survival. The lessons were, this boat would look after us. It was going to be cold and wet and very, very cramped. Here we are. This is the inside of this little sort of shelter, almost like a polytunnel that we'd rigged up. That's Arthur McGann, one of the crew members. Our clothing, incidentally, you'll notice is very traditional. It's actually woolen clothing. And we found that to be the most satisfactory. We tried some of the modern materials, but again, we weren't trying to replicate what the monks, how they lived. I mean, they were a lot tougher than us, and we were testing the vessel, not ourselves. This is George Maloney, who was the sailing master. He was the most experienced of the sailors on board, and I'd asked him to look after the sailing of the vessel.
Climb over everything. There were no gangways, nothing like that.
With cramp came sickness, as Brendan's supple hull flexed to the shape of each wave.
In the first couple of weeks, I was very sick because she rose incredibly. The phenomenal hides didn't help at all.
But stomachs soon settled, and as they sailed north, the crew learned the measure of their boat's performance. George Maloney, sailing master.
We were very fortunate in that we had some very nice winds for the next 2 days when we reckoned that we were achieving a height of perhaps 9 knots.
And we were literally, if the wind was in our favour, we could make 9 knots. Now, a modern cruising yacht would be very happy with that. Those who are technically minded, Brendan could not sail upwind. She could sail across the wind, and since this series is about navigation, the simplest way of sailing a vessel like this, which doesn't go against the wind, is when the wind's against you, you lower the sail and you drift slowly backwards. When the wind is sufficiently favourable, you hoist sail and you progress at about 3 or 4 times the speed that you went backwards. So eventually you will get there. Now this is perhaps not a modern attitude towards sailing, but it worked very well, and we really made good progress up the west coast of Scotland. And at that point, from the Hebrides, we started to head out towards the Faroes. This is filmed, incidentally, from a little rubber dinghy, which I subsequently obtained. And we were sailing north from the Hebrides towards the Faroes. You can see our route. We've gone through the Hebrides, heading up to Faroes. Now, we know that the Irish monks got to the Faroes. In fact, the place we landed is called Brendalsvik, which is Brendan's Creek in the Faroes. And in the story of St. Brendan, he comes to an island called the Island of Sheep. The Island of Sheep, translated into Faroese, is Faroes. It was the most dramatic of our landfalls because the tides run through Faroes in these very narrow channels between the islands. The tides can run at 6 and 7 knots. It's like a fast-flowing river. And we navigated by... we could see the clouds that built up over the land. Again, it's a series on navigation. Medieval navigation depended a huge amount upon eyesight, watching where wild birds are flying away or seabirds are flying, looking for clouds that build up over land. And we came in to Faroes, and believe me, it was terrifying.
Sailed to clear the tides. Brendan swept into Faroes at more than 10 knots. From his island of sheep, St. Brendan said he could look across a narrow sound to an island called the Paradise of Birds. Today, the Faroes are as famous for their sheep as ever, and seabirds still nest there in vast colonies.
So, when we left Faroes, we had a new crew member on board who's been on every one of my maritime expeditions since. He's a Faroese islander called Tróndur Patterson, and he showed us how to live off the sea. He's cutting up little bits of whale blubber and throwing them into the water behind the becalmed boat. He then takes a little piece of whale blubber and he puts it on a hook and streams the hook out behind. And
using it to bait a hook.
There it is.
The seabird's greed was Brendan's gain.
For those of you who are interested, the seabird, that is fulmar. It tastes a bit like pigeon. Most seabirds, seagulls, are sort of slightly pigeon taste to them, and they're excellent. So on subsequent voyages with Tronder, I've eaten, you know, guillemot and, now this famous story. Brendan lands on the back of a whale which he mistakes to be an island. And the scholars have said, oh, this is a story you get in Sinbad the Sailor. It's an old chestnut of voyaging stories. Those scholars have never been out in the North Atlantic in a skin boat, which is a little bit like a whale, because guess what? The whales all come up out of curiosity and visit you. And literally, day after day after day, we were being visited by the great whales. They'd come up right alongside and wallow there looking at us. I think they really thought that this whale-shaped boat covered in skin with a rib inside them was another sort of curious whale. And I think that the Irish did see vast numbers of whales, and that this is how that story developed.
Then as now, to a leather boat bobbing in his sea. Crouched in his tiny berth, Tronder spent every free moment sketching the daily scenes around him.
I'm happy to say that since that voyage, in the many years since that voyage, this was done in 76, 77, Tronder is now perhaps Scandinavia's most respected maritime artist. He is really a remarkable artist. We did have a little radio on board. It didn't work very well. I occasionally managed to make contact, and bless them, the Icelandic Coast Guard, for whom I retain to this day a very soft spot, sent out a plane to look for us, and they spotted us. We'd come from Faroes at the rate of about 120 miles every 24 hours, which is very good going. We had favourable winds, and that brought us to Reykjavik, where, again, the literary sources tell us the Irish had arrived, because when the Norse came there, they said they found that the papas, the fathers, had been there before them. This is our arrival into Reykjavik.
Going themselves, flocked to Reykjavik's harbour in welcome, for a boat from their own distant past.
Rather nicely, I was up in Iceland about a year ago, and they have a museum, national museum, which shows the Norse and the history of Iceland. And the first big photograph as you go in is a photograph of Brendan, which is really nice that it's sort of recognized by them. We took the boat out of the water, and here's the hull. You can see that it got barnacles and algae, but we scraped off the leather to check the grease, to check the leather, and it was really in superb condition. Nothing had deteriorated. The weather window had closed. I stayed up in Iceland, we all stayed there for about 5 weeks. The weather was a very, very bad ice year. The ice around Greenland was very thick, extended out a long way. It was not going to break, so I decided, and I'm actually a very cautious person, I said, we leave the boat here. After all, the Irish, and St. Brendan spends years on his voyage, they made stopovers. The Icelandic Coast Guard put Brendan in their aircraft hangar, and we came back there the next season. But Iceland conforms.
First St. Brendan's journey, the Irish monks came to a slag-covered island, whose fierce inhabitants flung burning coals at them. The sea hissed, the air was filled with stench, while the island blazed like a furnace. To those in search of Brendan's path, volcanic Iceland provides the same scenes to this day.
So we began the second sector, and here's Tronder carrying on board what we then took as food, smoked and dried meat, because he's actually lugging on board, I think that's smoked beef. If that falls into the bilge and the waves come over, you can still eat it. We adapted pretty much. The more and more we experienced our voyage, the further back we went to the technology of the time as being the most suitable for us. It was very straightforward. We just set up the H-frame, we put on the steering oar there, we loaded up with water, and the four of us set out. So those four, that's Arthur McGann, George Maloney, Tronda Patterson, and myself. We knew that this was going to be the real test of the boat, because we're going out from Reykjavik out into the Denmark Strait, heading for Greenland. Notorious for bad weather. We had been in one storm off the Irish coast, let's call it a heavy gale. We knew the boat would survive, but the conditions in the Denmark Strait, it was inevitable that we were going to get really bad weather. It was a curious feeling, kind of very reflective. I mean, we'd committed ourselves, so there wasn't really any turning back. The Icelandic Coast Guard said that they would come out with their patrol ships to the 200-mile limit, and they'd try and visit us from time to time. But after that, we were very much on our own. And we were very conscious that our real risk was of capsize or being swamped. And in those waters, the survival time is about 3 minutes. Everything was okay to begin with. We settled back down into our routine. Tronda went back to his drawing, and I mentioned we had a little rubber boat at this stage. There it is. It's like a little bathtub. It was allowed me. I was doing the filming with a clockwork camera. It was all pretty basic technology, I have to say. The whales reappeared almost immediately. Just a day out of Iceland, our companions returned, and Tronda, of course, goes back to feeding us. There's our larder on the stern of the vessel. And this is skinned fulmar.
It was only a lull before the inevitable foul weather. 9 days out, by St. Brendan's Day, the weather would show a different face as the crew huddled amidships to celebrate.
Well, it's a toast to St. Brendan on St. Brendan's Day.
St. Brendan.
St. Brendan.
At 200 miles, Brendan passed beyond the protective care of Iceland's Coast Guard patrols. Within 48 hours, the weather began to deteriorate rapidly.
The radio on board Brendan was actually powered by some little solar panels. Again, they were fairly primitive solar panels. It was a high-frequency radio. We didn't have the possibility of satellite communication, as you would use today. And that solar power gave me, I think, 60 seconds of transmission a day. Again, the Icelanders and the Canadians and the Danes on the tip of Greenland, their radio operators listened out for us. But essentially, I think we made contact with shore stations only 3 times during the next 50 days. And we were very much on our own. The weather did deteriorate, and Tronda, still to that time, we'll keep fishing.
By May 24th, Brendan was running into gales rising to force 9. Sail was shortened to a bare minimum. The crew put on full survival gear.
just watching this filming during the gale. The real risk on Brendan was undoubtedly capsize. There were a couple of nights when things really were very difficult. We got swamped. The first occasion, I was actually down sleeping in my sleeping bag, and there was this castle pump and this just water. I was floating in the water, so was George, who was my watch companion, and you just get out and you throw the water in the darkness back out into the sea. And I think the worst night was the second night. It was very dark. I just want to point out here, if you look at the pictures, you see we're streaming ropes behind us to slow the boat down. All we could do was run downwind and use directly downwind with a tiny sail and let the waves come past you. That night, and the night time was the worst part, you could hear each wave coming up behind you, and it just did sound like an express train. And it would just come out of the darkness, the whole boat would lurch and go screaming down the face of the wave, and you just had to keep the boat level and hope she neither capsized nor got swamped. And I have to say that it was an experience, I think, which set for all of us a level of fear.
They streamed out heavy ropes to slow her down.
It was every 15, 17 seconds. It was like being almost in a car crash. And the boat survived. She didn't roll over. And then, of course, we checked to see if she was falling apart. And in fact, she was fine. There was absolutely nothing wrong with the stitching. Everything was all right. We'd rigged up that leather in front of the lower part of the screen, like a kind of, I remembered the Roman army used to, hold these leather shields over their heads. I rigged that as shields to stop the waves breaking into the vessel. Obviously you can't film at the height of a storm, it's far too dangerous. But Brendan did survive. Subsequently, I was told that the Icelandic Coast Guard were reporting force 10 in the area. I don't think we were ever in anything as bad as that. But in a very small boat, when you get between the really big waves, the wind's going right over the top. It's the waves that matter, not the strength of the wind, really.
And her leather hull had hardened in the icy water like metal.
As George repairing a sail afterwards, and again, I can remember filming this. He was repairing away, and you heard the whoosh. It was always the whale breathing out, and he looks over, and there's a sperm whale. Now, I showed this subsequently to marine biologists, and they said sperm whales shouldn't be up there at that time. And I said, but you were seeing whales the whole time. They said, well, and there were two of them, two large bull sperm whales, in an area where, according to the marine biologists at that time, they don't exist. However, having seen the footage, now we know that they do swim up there. I tried to contact Greenland. The Danes maintain a radio station at Prince Christiansund. I couldn't get through. Our antenna height was too low, and we were pretty much on our own. I had been told that the ice again was very bad around Greenland, so that instead of landing in Greenland, I made the decision we wouldn't land in Greenland, we'd head around Cape Farewell, the southern tip of Greenland, and try and go direct to North America, where we ran in. Here you can see our track, turned round by the gale. That's just a survival time there. That's the ice to the north. And we ran into this characteristic of the North Atlantic, the heavy fog, dense fog, and it's what St. Brendan encountered.
On his journey, St. Brendan was asked by one of his companions, "Do you know what this fog is?" "What?" said St. Brendan. "This fog encircles that land you've been seeking these 7 years." Was the fog through which the modern Brendan now sailed coincidence? Or was it further proof of ancient Irish knowledge of these icy waters? Severe weather had battered another tiny ocean traveller. One day, a small migrating bird dropped exhausted on Brendan's deck.
Here's George trying to give the bird some water. This is a nice little sequence because there's Trunda, who, is the person who feeds off the seabirds, and clearly his head is an ideal spot. Every good thinking bird. Now, at this stage, we were past the tip of Greenland. We'd had no contact with the outside world. I had an emergency radio beacon, which I switched on, thinking that this might help people locate us. What happened instead, there was no response to that. A few days later, the fog lifted, and we saw a sight that I didn't anticipate, and I didn't like the look of. That is the edge of the Labrador pack ice to the north of us. The Labrador pack was much further south than usual, and we were sailing along its edge, and these are little bits of ice which have broken off, melting ice. And the best thing about the pack ice is that you get favourable winds, from our point of view, along the ice edge. And so I couldn't contact land, I decided to sail along the ice edge and head for Newfoundland, because Labrador was impossible. And we headed on thinking that, all was well. We were about 4/5 through our journey. You can see the little bits of melt ice there.
The crew relaxed in anticipation of the long journey's end. They had barely 200 miles to go. Suddenly, in the small hours of June 18th, came a sickening rasp that no one at first recognized. Brendan had run into ice. The very winds that swept her home had broken the pack to the north and blown it across her path.
That was the strangest thing. In the middle of the night, you knew you were out in the ocean, and that thin leather hull hit something. I thought, of course, initially it was flotsam. I can remember scrambling out in a panic, switching on the torch, and this is what we saw. In the dark, we had sailed into the pack, and we had, you're going to see some quite strained faces at this stage. We had no choice. We simply had to sail on through that. We had to wriggle our way through. There was one advantage. The pack ice muffled the waves, so we were no longer in fear. There was a very strong wind blowing of capsize. That's the best thing about pack ice. You don't have these huge waves. And we pushed our way through.
Throughout the day, Brendan staggered forward through the same ice that a week before had sunk a steel icebreaker nearby. Yet here was she, a medieval boat of leather. After 14 hours, the danger seemed to be lessening, when suddenly Brendan struck a submerged piece of ice. She gave a peculiar shudder. She was holed.
I think that one of the second worst night was actually having to keep her afloat. We knew she was punctured, and then if the best moment of the entire voyage was next day when I'd been pumping that night and there was phosphorescence in the water, and I was right against the hull of the boat, pumping away, and I saw a flicker of phosphorescence outside, and it was repeated inside the semi-waterlogged boat. And I thought to myself, there must be a connection around this area. And so at dawn, I crawled around the boat looking, and believe me, the best moment of that entire voyage was not the end of it, was actually locating the puncture and realizing that it was close enough to the surface, it was underwater obviously, for somebody with long arms to reach it, and that person was George.
And spare leather was cut to mending. Plunging raw hands into the frozen sea, George started stitching from the outside. If he failed, Brendan was done for. Inside the hull, Trundle passed the needle back. 3 frozen hours later, Brendan was saved and watertight again.
That pack ice had sunk an icebreaker to the north of us 2 days before. And the fact that we were such a small boat, and we either slid up onto the pack ice or we bounced off it, and then when we were finally punctured, it was because we must have hit some very hard ice, we were able to repair the boat. And again, I think back to John O'Connell, who showed us how to stitch leather properly. And it was his knowledge, I think, contributed to our survival. So we sailed on. The Canadian Coast Guard, their 200-mile limit, met us with an icebreaker, and this was actually taken from their icebreaker's bridge. We sailed on to our destination.
And the legend had looked more like the truth with every mile. On her last morning at sea, her old friends the whales surfaced alongside her in a dance of farewell. In 1977, the leather boat Brendan reached the New World at 8 p.m. on June the 26th on the shore of Peckford Island off the Newfoundland coast. She reached the shore, and a man was landing. She had nothing more to prove.
We'll just take her to the harbour. Tie her up.
The purpose was simply to show that the technology of the Irish monks was capable of reaching North America. And this is a lovely moment because it was a fishing community, and the word has spread that we were coming to their harbour, and they all came down to, we were towed into a place called Musgrave Harbour on the coast of Newfoundland. And they got themselves a traffic jam on the way down to the harbour. It was lovely. I mean, the fishing people were just so enthusiastic. I have to say, many of the people that live in that area are descendants of immigrants from County Wexford, and they actually speak with a Wexford accent still. They have the Wexford songs. And we were towed in, great jubilation. We were very exhausted. We'd been 50 days on Brendan since we left Reykjavik. And it was a great moment. I think we were just so tired at that stage.
Yeah, you running, John? We're rolling. Okay. Well, are you satisfied with everything that you've done?
Pretty much so. I think we're all, just overwhelmed that it's all worked out so well.
Tell me, what was the worst part of your trip?
I think we probably each one of us got a worst part. For me, it was we ran into some very heavy weather between Iceland and Greenland, quite really heavy weather in the Denmark Strait. And we were out in it for about 24 hours, and I thought that every wave could have taken us. But we were lucky, and the boat looked after us.
And you did strike some ice that punctured her?
Yes, we were about 24 hours in the pack, and just as we were getting out of the pack, we were unlucky and we got nipped, and a sharp corner of what must have been very old ice punctured the hull. And of course, inevitably it was a gale, and inevitably we had night coming on, and we had a pretty dismal night pumping her out until dawn, and then George and Trondheim managed to get a patch stitched on her in mid-ocean, which you couldn't do with anything but a leather hull.
Did it leak other than that?
No, we were actually taking less than 8 gallons a day.
Is there any sign at all of it deteriorating after all these months?
Absolutely none, and believe me, if we'd been in a wooden boat in the ice, we'd have just been crushed.
Does this satisfy you then that the devilish Irish probably did come across here?
It satisfies me that they had the technical knowledge and the ability to get here.
Thank you very much. Welcome again.
So, I stress, we only showed that it was possible, not that it was done. Brendan is now in a museum in County Mayo, not far from Shannon Airport. Trondheim, as I say, is now a well-known artist. George has been delivering yachts for years. Arthur lives in Ireland. I've gone on to do other expeditions, usually all the maritime ones, with Trondheim as a companion, and bringing things right up to date for you. And a slight plug, because I have had this experience of those waters, I've actually turned and become a historical novelist, writing a series called Viking, in which, should you ever read any, you will recognize conditions that you've seen in reality on the screen. Thank you very much.